Fresh boys, clean boys, sweet baby New Year's boys. Welcome to the pod, people. And it's not a dream, it is still 2019. I'm Matisse Van Rossum, and I'm joined, as always, by the other baby New Year's boys.
I'm Ben Sheets, and we about to lay 2018 in the dirt.
Like pipe.
I'm Cleveland Mosier. I'm just along for the ride.
Choo-choo.
Toot toot, motherfucker. Let's get this rolling.
Yeah. So we back. If you listened to our episode last week, you know that we are talking about some films that we are catching up on from 2018. This is going to be a little bit different than usual because we were separated when we watched these movies. Cleveland and I watched all of them together, but we have not discussed them really at all with Ben.
I'm the wild card.
Mm-hmm.
So I know how Cleveland and I feel about all three of these movies, but we're maybe going to get into some contentious nonsense.
I know a little bit about how Ben feels about some of these films, and I could pretty confidently say that we are definitely going to get into some stuff, and I'm personally very excited about
Well, in that case, let's get through all the preamble and let's just jump right in.
Sounds great.
The first film that we're going to be talking about is Apostle.
Netflix original.
Netflix Originals Apostle, directed by
Gareth Evans.
Gareth Evans, that's right. The dude who did The Raid. I forgot about that already. Weird. When I saw his name come up in the opening credits, I was like, this is bizarre.
See, I knew that going in. I almost feel like that
Influenced you a little bit?
me a little bit in what I was expecting.
Well, fortunately, for the sake of scientific method, I have not seen The Raid, and I'm not familiar with his previous work. So
I also have not seen The Raid, but I am familiar with The Raid.
You guys should see The Raid. It's
I
very
know,
good.
I know.
Very good.
It's been on my list for a really long time. But Apostle is set in 1905, and it follows a man whose sister is kidnapped by a cult and held for hostage because their father is wealthy. And he is to infiltrate the island where they have sort of a utopian commune kind of thing.
it's a Wicker Man setup.
It is the Wicker Man.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially.
And some weird culty shit ensues, as is to be expected. I know that at least for you and I, Cleveland, the film started very strong.
Yes, which
Interesting.
Yeah, Ben, why don't you...
Yeah, what were your
Well,
thoughts? Ben?
I thought the first half was extremely slow to its detriment almost, because it does do the Wicker Man thing very closely.
Yeah.
In my opinion, it doesn't do it as well as the Wicker Man.
No.
You know, and for me, it felt just like a slow...
Well, okay, we should clarify which Wicker Man.
Oh, the 70s Wicker Man.
Okay, I thought so, but maybe for some of the viewers who don't know that the Nicolas Cage remake is based on a film from the 70s might think that we're crazy.
We'll do a Wicker Man episode down the line.
For sure.
Speaking of thinking that people are crazy, y'all might feel that way about me because I have seen the Nicolas Cage version, but I have not seen the original.
I think that's true for most people.
You want my scorching nuclear take?
Scorch me, baby.
The Wicker Man remake is pretty enjoyable.
It is. I agree with you 100%, but it's that kind of Nicolas Cage batshit crazy enjoyable, whereas the original one is like legitimately quite unsettling and creepy. And
They go for very different things. Yeah. And if you're looking for the 70s in the remake, you're going to be in for a bad time. And if you're looking for the stuff in the remake in the original, you're going to have a bad time.
Right.
I think is honestly usually the best way to do a remake,
but
is to try and achieve something different.
This is not a Wicker Man discussion. No. We'll just say from here on out that any comparisons we make to the Wicker Man are largely in comparison to the original. But yeah, you thought that the beginning was slow.
Yeah,
in a bad way.
I thought it was slow. There were a couple of exceptions for scenes that I thought were very effective in the first half, but overall I thought it was kind of monotonous didn't really tonally work with the rest of the movie super well, and kind of just bored me, to be honest. The exception would probably be the interrogation scene.
Yeah.
And throughout the movie, I think Dan Stevens steals the show, but
Which one is Dan Stevens?
Is he
the main
Quinn?
character?
Oh, the main
yeah,
character.
yeah.
Okay.
very
I forgot his name, but I immediately recognized him as the guy from The Guest.
Yeah.
Which is a fucking awesome movie. I thought he did pretty well. I also liked Michael Sheen quite a bit.
Yes.
I have problems with his character arc. But
Yeah.
I liked his performance.
Yeah, I would fully agree, and to the point of putting the blanket statement over the film that the acting was in no part a problem in this film. Like I thought all the actors did a phenomenal job with what they had.
For the most part, I really liked the guy who played Quinn. I don't remember that actor's name. He was the one who ended up being the villain in the second half.
Oh yeah.
I liked him a lot. I have a really huge problem with what they did to his character in the third act, because I think the way that they were building him up was really solid. Especially the dynamic between him and Michael Sheen. Like, Michael Sheen is like the prophet. He's the leader of this cult, but he's not its sole founder. He washed up on this island with two of his other fellow convicts, and they started a utopia. They're fed by a goddess who provides them bounties in exchange for blood sacrifice. The Wicker Man.
Yeah.
I'll reiterate.
But they do keep that stuff very vague.
Yes.
In the first half, to the point
which is actually what I liked. I liked how vague they kept it in the first half. I actually didn't have a problem with how slow it was.
Same.
Because I thought it was doing a really good job building intrigue and mood, easing you into a lot of the characters rather than slapdash introducing you to a bunch of people and just expecting you to know and care about all of these people right off the bat.
I agree fully, and we'll go even farther with that. I absolutely love period pieces, and I have just a huge heart-on for set making and costume design, and I think that the story could have been slower paced and more boring, and I would have been there for it. Like, I just to see the cool sets.
Well,
I was happy as a clam just looking at the interiors and the cool like leather like cloaks and stuff. Like, it just I
agree with
10
you.
out of 10 on the set making.
The set and costume design was really good. I will agree with that, but I don't know if I would slow it down any more than it was.
No, that's a personal
I think
opinion,
it
if
gets
there
a
ever
little
was.
convoluted with all the subplots in the first half too. There's a lot going on in the first half. But the thing is, like, it is very slow paced at the same time, just because none of the characters are given all that much to do. Ultimately, I think.
Well, there's a lot of our protagonist discovering who all of the characters are as he spends more time on the island, which I didn't have a problem with, and I do think that for the amount of other little subplots that there are, I think it was good that it was a bit slower so it can kind of ease you into the subplots. I have a problem with the payoff of a lot of those subplots. I ultimately have a lot of problems with the third act of this film in general. And it's where it really lost it for me, because I think its setup was doing a lot of good.
See, I feel almost the opposite way. I think the second half is a lot of schlocky fun, where the first half kind of sets it up to be serious. And I think Gareth Evans is strongest when he's doing these, frantic, kinetic action sequences, or sequences that are very visceral. Like the standout scene in this movie, and the one that I would probably put as one of the top scenes of the year for 2018, would be the cave scene, when Dan Stevens, the main character, is going through the cave with blood.
Oh, he's crawling through the blood tunnel?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I thought that scene was okay, but I didn't have a problem with that scene, but it didn't stand out over a lot of other things.
When the goddess comes out of the blood,
I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah, here's what I'll say. I fully agree with how effective that scene was. I really liked that scene too, and it did a lot for me. By the end of the film, that scene was sort of tainted for me, and maybe you guys can correct me on this, but that scene was sort of broken by their world building.
Yes.
Like, it did not make any sense.
I agree.
At the end of it,
that.
and I would, definite footnote on that. We'll need to talk about their world building because that was very problematic.
What I'll say is I agree that the last part of the movie is a lot more schlocky, but in this case, I think it's undeserved because I think in the first half of the movie, it very much had me with its world building and the things that it was setting up. It was presenting itself as a serious drama horror, and I was accepting it as such.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the third act, it became a completely different film that it had not set me up to expect, and that hurt it for me because I was disappointed that the dramatic aspects of it that I was enjoying did not have satisfying payoff in the same tone. It felt like to me that at one point Gareth Evans is like, oh shit, my script is due tomorrow and I still have to write the entire third act, and buried his face in a mountain of cocaine and just like scratched out a rough draft of the final act and then gave it to the producers like, here's the movie.
I agree. It felt very rushed to me, and not from a directorial standpoint, but from a writing standpoint, and that's where I was hurt. I think this film suffered, and I would like to also bring up a comparative to another film that came out this year that we've already discussed that did a similar thing but effectively, and that's of course Mandy with the Cheddar Goblin sequence.
Right.
That film makes it very clear. There's a definitive moment where the button is pushed that alters what the film is. Like there's an arc. There's an arc sequence, and then when Cheddar Goblin comes on, it is made fully clear to you that you're about to go for a fucking wild Disney ride of horror. And this film does not do that in the same way. There's no definitive moment where the things suddenly kick off. I felt like the writing was just set aside and the action was prioritized.
They seem to forget their rules.
Right,
as soon as the action kicked off.
Took away from the action for me.
Yeah,
it made it a lot harder for me
agree.
to enjoy the action because it felt displaced.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I didn't get much out of the first half and the serious drama stuff. And I think that's why I enjoyed the second half more.
Yes.
I think because I didn't connect with it as much.
The
visceral action was more entertaining because I wasn't wrapped up in the story as much.
I think what can be said is that whichever tone of the movie you connect with, the other tone is not going to work for you.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, as a whole, for the film, a problem.
Yes, it doesn't have
Regardless of which...
it has bad tonal control.
Regardless of which part you like better, the serious drama world building at the beginning or the schlocky action at the end, whichever, you're not going to like both of them, most likely.
Yeah.
And whichever one that you do like, the other one is going to be a huge drag for you.
It's definitely one is tainted by the other.
Yeah,
and also, Ben, I really appreciate how you brought up that point too, because like it made it very easy for, I think, Tisa and I both to recognize your justifications for liking the beginning of it, and that's neat. Like I think we still disagree on those things, but it's obviously for personal preference. Yeah,
and I think
not academic reasons.
You know, like I think it was the Coen brothers that said directing is like an act of tonal control. And in a way, this movie is just badly directed because that tonal control just is not there.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but
Like-
there's a definite turning point.
Would you say it's the tunnel scene?
No, because I was still
Actually,
I was still on board at that point. I would say it is immediately after the sacrifice scene.
I actually think the key tonal shift for me was when the guy kills his daughter. That I think is where things kind of flew off the rails.
That's where it starts. That's where it started to lose me.
Yeah, like
I was there for the sacrifice scene where he of course blames his daughter's murder on her boyfriend, and they ritually murder him in a particularly horrific fashion.
Oh man, we get some cool like era torture devices.
True.
In
I
this
thought
movie.
I thought that scene
That
was,
stuff
I
was
thought that
rad.
scene was really well done.
It was almost Saw-esque.
Yes, where they like strap him down to this big table and like drill into his skull and his
Yeah.
Right.
brain.
And there is
like,
a term for that. And it's actually brought up in the Endless also, which I thought was interesting. But there's
well,
Trepanation.
it's
trepanation. Thank you, Ben.
Trepanation,
Yeah,
yeah.
like, and that you see devices from that era that, well, obviously shorter spikes and less invasive, but
Well,
you
the
see
I-
trepanation devices from that time period and before where they're used, and it's cool to see like a trepanation device used to kill. Like, neat.
right
Very
because
neat. Love
because
that machine.
The idea is to drill a small hole in your skull and not touch the brain, so you basically stay high all the time. Or in olden days, to be closer to God. But in this case, it's a really huge fucking drill, and they drill all the way into his skull, into his brains, and it's really gross and horrifying. And I thought that scene was really well done.
Legitimately unsettling because you
especially-
do feel for that character.
Especially at that point, because the Quinn character has at that point sort of decisively decided that he's taking over the cult, because he thinks that Michael Sheen's character is too weak and unwilling to do what is necessary to keep them all alive, and their crops are failing and shit. And so I think that turning point is really strong, but it's after that where all of my problems start to come lower. Just like,
My first problem does come up right beforehand, and I'll set it up sort of how I was experiencing it, and that's the setup for that sequence starts much earlier on in the film when you see Quinn like deliver a baby goat, and you see that the baby goat has sort of become malformed and dies almost
diseased,
immediately.
yeah.
Which sort of sets a precedent that the goddess who is controlling this island is, has an effect over both the crops and the livestock, and that, like there's a sort of problem with like birthing, and that there's an issue with that on this
Right.
island where like abominations are being created, and the higher ups in the church are trying to keep that hush hush.
right.
Later on, it's revealed that Quinn's young teenage daughter is pregnant, and there's a sequence between the two of them which is very uncomfortable in I think a good way. Like it's very effectively uncomfortable where they have a dialogue, and I loved it because without that justification of the goddess like malforming the children,
The island
like,
is
born,
not. The island is not fertile.
yeah, without that context, the father appears to be exclusively in the wrong. Like if it was just a puritanical father getting very angry with his daughter and punishing her for getting pregnant, like that's
one thing,
one thing. Like that's problematic. But in his case, he was sort of justified, and that was very interesting to me to see that in any other context, villainous character. With a bit of justification, he would be worried that his daughter is going to give birth to a fucking Lovecraftian horror, and
he says as much. He says that abomination in your womb will kill you,
right? And
that scene is very good. But then it cuts, and we see the boyfriend come back to the house, and Quinn has just murdered her with a knife,
right? And that was the scene, like literally, like while we were watching it, made me eat my words because I brought up that point, like when he's like, well, like you can't have this abomination in you. The scene cuts away to the guy outside, and I said as much. I was like, "Oh yeah, this is great! Like I love that they did that with
like,
the
that
context
makes
for it.
that
like,
makes sense.
Wow, he's
yeah.
kind." And I literally said, "Man, he's actually kind of in the right." And then it cuts back to him, and the daughter's just been murdered, and I was like, "Oh fuck, wait, no, never mind. Just ate all of my words."
Right? No, I agree with you. That I thought that was bad
like
as well.
If he tried to like get rid of the abomination and she'd accidentally died, I think that would have been way more effective.
And the thing is like up till this point, they've been setting up Quinn to be an interesting and somewhat sympathetic villain, but obviously like still in the wrong in what he's doing and what he believes. But after that, he just becomes completely cartoonish.
Yeah, that was a messy scene to say the least.
Well, and where they take his character from there to the end of the film, and where they sort of start to forget some of their rules and their world building, as it's revealed that they have imprisoned the goddess somehow.
Right. The agency of the goddess, I think, is by far the biggest flaw in their world building.
Same. I agree with that because throughout the film, we see her at times wandering the town and the island. Well, and they all the people of the cult, you know, they bleed themselves every night, and they leave a jar of blood outside their doors. And we get that great scene where the protagonist sees all of the jars of blood, and he steals some for his own jar so he doesn't have to cut himself. And you see the goddess standing at the hall behind him, and he cuts himself and drops blood on the floor. And it does that really jarring cut to like her mouth under the floorboards, like greedily sucking at the blood that he's dropped.
And we need to be clear too that the protagonist never sees her in this time.
Correct.
Only the viewer does. And then later on, there's the blood tunnel sequence we'd already talked about, where the main character falls into the tunnel, or whatever, and he gets chased, and he does see her, and he gets chased through like the blood tunnel by this old spooky woman. So yeah, we see her a number of times walking about and interacting with the world,
seemingly having agency in the world.
Right. It's not a dream sequence. Like, that's made clear by the viewer seeing her without any context to the other characters. Clearly, she's wandering about. Maybe it's like a semi-ghost form or something else, but she has power over that world. Like,
she can physically interact with the world.
And walk about under her own free will.
Yet then it's revealed later that Michael Sheen and Quinn and the other guy have her imprisoned in a shed.
And have always had her imprisoned.
We get a single flashback to when they come to the island originally and find her sitting under a tree wrapped in a blanket.
Like, I'm almost concerned bringing these points up because I feel like I missed something. Was there a point that justified these things? Ben, did you feel?
No, it was just a mess, honestly.
Yeah, like there was nothing.
Well, Quinn claims that he's the only one who had the vision to turn her into a machine.
Yeah.
It was his idea to imprison her. And by imprison, like, she's just like bound by all of these like vines and limbs and branches, which is confusing because we never see how they did that, and that she is a nature goddess. We see that when Michael Sheen like feeds her blood, that all of those limbs that are imprisoning her bloom and leaves grow. How did they imprison her? We never see that.
Ever. It's a huge problem with the world building.
And also, how is she imprisoned and, like you said, also able to wander about?
Yeah, it makes zero sense. And again, I'm more than happy to embrace either of those things. Like, for the sake of the narrative, but not both of them.
But pick one.
Yeah. Exactly.
Because they don't make sense together.
I think that the moral that we can all agree on for this film, I do have one more point to bring up, but I think the moral we can all agree on for this movie is pick a fucking lane.
Yeah.
Yeah,
like is pick a lane,
and
like,
stay in it.
It's just a total mess.
I'm really glad you brought up that piece of dialogue from Quinn about him saying that like we put the god on the machine, because I also had a huge problem with that in the film. The structure of this movie when it comes to tension building is almost exclusively with the payoff of Deus Ex Machinas.
Yes.
Every time that the protagonist is saved, it's because of a Deus Ex Machina, which is fine because that is sort of that is set up in the world building, like with the goddess sort of looking out for him. The problem is that the goddess is never explained, so we don't know how much of an effect there is there.
We also learn midway through the movie that he was a priest in China during the Boxer Rebellion when they were killing Christians, and we see a flashback scene where he has like a massive cross like branded on his back, and he talks about his loss of faith and how he no longer believes in God. And then by the end of the movie, he has regained his faith because literally every time he's saved, like you said, it's an act of God.
Preordained. Yeah.
It's a Deus Ex Machina.
It is a god on the machine descending down to save him.
Exactly, especially because Quinn is like, she's nothing but a machine. You know, we feed her blood, and she makes our crops bountiful. So it's literally like Deus Ex Machinas on Deus Ex Machinas.
And I don't have a huge problem with it.
Arc,
but in many other contexts, I would have a bit of a problem with it, because essentially when the writers gave Quinn that piece of dialogue, it's them saying, hey, look, we just justified all our Deus Ex Machinas. But they sort of did in the script. The problem is that it falls apart because of the world building. That's never fully explained why. Like, how much divine power does she have?
Right.
And it's not and it would be fine if it was ambiguous, but it it's not. It breaks itself. But yeah, like there are a number of sequences where the Deus Ex Machinas are effective. Like I like the one when they're going down the line telling the guys to read the parts of their scripture.
To quote the scripture.
Yeah, and it's coming up to the protagonist who doesn't know the words, but there's the guy before him, like
who turns out to be an assassin.
Yeah, that was great.
I liked that a lot too.
That was nice. It was fairly believable. A number of very like effective Deus Ex Machinas, but not all of them, and especially at the end, there were times where it was just you could call it before it happens. Like, oh, here comes another Deus Ex Machina. I'm not married to the tension.
Can we talk about the man in the vine mask?
Oh, I wanted to talk about that actually.
Yes,
the grinder scene.
Yeah.
Because I thought that torture device was pretty
I thought
rad.
the torture device was very cool with the hooks and like pulling, like hooking a body and then pulling it into this big old meat grinder. I thought that was very cool. My problem is, who is that character? Where did he come from?
It's a monster.
Why is he there? Who? And that also goes.
The thing I gathered from the first half, which I guess you guys didn't get as much of, is I found the story in the first half very weak. So I kind of just started tuning out the story in the second half, and I had a lot more fun with scenes like that because I think Gareth Evans, with his history of doing crazy action movies like the Raid movies, he's proven that like his strength is not necessarily story. And that was clear to me in the first half. But I think the scenes of action were a lot of fun in this movie. And I thought the meat grinder scene, while that Vine monster guy was goofy as hell and like didn't have any reason to exist in the movie.
No.
I thought the design was kind of cool, and the action scene that he was in was
I agree fully.
Enough.
I think that like I personally, I didn't have a problem with the Vine guy either. I thought his coolness was enough to justify it, and you could come up with something within their narrative that would justify him being there. But and also the action scenes were cool. The devices were fucking rad. But again, that was sort of soured for me by their lack of the fact that in many cases they broke world building to have them in there or whatever else.
Exactly.
And in fixable ways. Another pass, with that script, you could have fixed those things and had those scenes play out the same way.
Like with the Vine guy, we see he's only in the shed where the goddess is. We never see him anywhere else. So he's the caretaker of the goddess, right? We still don't know who the fuck he is or where he has come from, but it's his job to take care of her. Another thing that's very confusing about where they can't decide what they want the goddess to be is we see multiple times that she subsists on blood sacrifice. It's what gives her her power. It's what she needs to survive. And she is obviously starved for the blood. She's greedy for it. Yet, at the same time, we also see this vine-masked man grinding up dead bodies and force-feeding them to her in a funnel, which she does not seem very much about. Mm-hmm. She resists. So which is it? Does she want the blood or does she not want the blood?
Yep.
Like, why is this weird gimp torture man here? Ugh, why?
Yeah.
Why?
Like, it's almost like there are two goddesses, but there aren't. I'm glad you brought that up because that's another huge world-breaking point.
It would even be one thing if they suggested the idea that there are two aspects of the goddess. But they don't do that.
Nope.
Yeah.
It's just inconsistent.
And you'd think for how convoluted the story gets at points, like they would like cover all their bases in that respect, but they really covered the wrong bases in a lot of ways. They tie up weird subplots while leaving others just completely open-ended. Oh, yeah. It's just narratively a mess.
Another one that I had a huge problem with regarding Quinn's character is we obviously see that he has a problem with his daughter being pregnant. He's scared of the malformed abomination that her child will be. Yet at the end of the movie, he has kidnapped Michael Sheen's daughter
Oh, yeah.
and the main character's sister, and says that his plan is going to be to personally impregnate both of them and sacrifice their babies to the goddess, and do this ad nauseum in order to make the island bountiful.
Yeah.
So which is it? Are the babies going to be born malformed or not? And also that takes a character that is relatively nuanced at the beginning, building up to that, and just turns him into
Snidely fucking Whiplash.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it was very, very problematic. Things I liked about the movie. I thought it had a fucking awesome budget, and I liked where they put their money. Like, I think I don't have any problems with where the budgeting was placed into this film. It had a huge budget, obviously. It's a Netflix film, and the sets were grandiose.
Piece, so, yeah.
It's full of competent actors who are known, and the special effects are pretty sound across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I love the period production design. I wish there were more torture devices and action scenes.
Yeah, but I think there were enough. I will say, I think that the ones that they had were fucking rad, and that there were several of them.
They weren't until the second half, and once again, that shift is the problem we all have with that.
Yeah.
You wanted more during the beginning. Yeah, that makes sense. What I'll say is, and I know that you disagree with me on this, Tease, and I know for a fact you're also going to disagree with me on this strongly, but what I would have wanted out of the film, and again, I know y'all are going to disagree with me on this, and I know your points, and your points are valid too, but because it's a personal preference thing, but I would have liked to have seen this film as, here come the gags, a long format series. I would have liked to have seen about 5 or 6 episodes, hour-long episodes out of this in that set. I would have loved to have seen the storyline stretched out with a little bit more world building placed in. I wanted to explore that island more and the effects of the and the abilities of the goddess.
See,
I would have liked to
have
have seen more of that.
If they did a mini-series version of
But
this,
better
would
written.
you like to see the tone of the first half or the second half, or the same where it tonally just shifts in the middle?
Both, just with justification for the tonal shifts.
Here's
Because
my
I liked the tonal parts. I think, as we've discussed it more and we've talked about it, I don't think that it's necessarily a matter of that the tonal shift was bad. I just think the tonal shift wasn't justified. Like, if the scripting had been written to frame it, it would have been more effective. Because again, I liked the torture sequences. I liked the action. I liked that. I just didn't like their justification for it.
I just think they should have picked one. My problem with the idea of making this a mini series is that they could not competently tell a cohesive narrative across the span of 2.5 hours, and I think that by stretching that out into 6 episodes or more would have worsened that.
Yes. I agree with that. It's with the addendum that with better writing, like, and with cohesive world building. If it had that, I think it would be a really cool series.
I would even say with a different director, because I really like Gareth Evans, but I think his strengths are not quite suited for this movie. Just because while the action scenes are really cool, a lot of the rest of the story and world building stuff kind of falls on its face. Mm-hmm. And in addition, the movie as is probably should have been at least half an hour shorter than it was.
Agreed.
They could have cut a couple of those subplots because it just gets convoluted.
Or had more intrigue at the beginning, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it overall. Like, I can appreciate the handling of the action scenes and the saw like torture devices and stuff, but it's ultimately that really bad tonal inconsistency between the first 2 acts of the film and then the third act that really made this a mess for me. And I think there are still a lot of things that I appreciated about it. Mm-hmm. I don't hate this movie by any means, but
just disappointed.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. It's like it had a lot of potential to be really good, but it wasted that potential by not being able to decide what kind of movie it wanted to be.
Go ahead and add some final thoughts and throw
yeah,
a
no,
rating on
that's
that.
what I was gonna do. Yeah, I like a lot of the things about the movie. I liked the world building up to a point. I liked a lot of the characters up to a point. I agree with you that the set design and costume design was probably the strongest aspect of the film. There was a lot of really cool stuff to look at. And so in that sense, they used their budget very well. Overall, not a terrible film, but largely disappointing because of its tonal inconsistency. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5 pods.
Yeah, so I think Gareth Evans does a strong job with action in this movie. Where it really falls on its face is the story. Like we've been saying, it's very messy and tonally inconsistent. I thought the acting was strong and the period design was strong, but overall, just it was all over the place and didn't decide on one, consistent tone throughout, which was its ultimate shortcoming. So I'm gonna give it a 3 as well.
I have little to add. I think we're in pretty good agreement on this one. I did want to ask. It's been a week or two since I've seen it. What were y'all's thoughts on the score, the soundtrack?
I don't remember it.
Neither do I. But I think probably effective. I guess it wasn't bad.
Inoffensive.
Yeah.
But
clearly,
but largely forgettable. I can't remember anything about it.
Yeah. I remember digging on some Gregorian chanting stuff that they did, and some heavenly choir stuff at the beginning.
At the very beginning, yeah.
Anyway, that's all. Yeah. Also a 3 from me. I think it was. Okay. It had some strong moments, but at the end, it didn't pay off the way I wanted it.
All right.
Ideally.
Unanimous 3 out of 5 pods for Apostle. Let us know your thoughts on it. Which half do you like better? Yeah. Are there people out there who like the whole thing? Because if so, tell me about it.
Go watch the Raid movies instead of this.
Yeah, I haven't even seen them, and I can say that that's probably a safe bet.
But I'm curious to see them. Yeah.
All right, moving on. Okay, so the next film we're going to be talking about is Summer of '84, an 80s nostalgia trip written by 2 people and directed by 3 other people.
Well, I already know what you feel about this movie.
Y'all strap yourselves in. We're about to disagree hard.
Well, this movie was directed by the people who did Turbo Kid.
I didn't know that.
Right.
Which, when I found that out, makes a lot of sense.
It does.
It is a story about a group of kids in the summer of '84 living in the suburbs. There is a serial killer in the area, and they believe it is one of the kids' police officer neighbor. And so they spend the whole movie investigating and trying to get to the root of the mystery.
That is accurate.
I'll let you guys start, I guess.
Okay. Oh man.
Yeah.
I did not like this movie at all, which is a shame because I went into it expecting good things, having heard relatively good things, and it was a supreme letdown. I think for both of us, Cleveland. I think you hated it more than I did.
Yeah. I found this film to be a bummer of '84, if anything, and that is not an excuse for a pun.
Summer of disappointment.
I was very bummed out by this movie, and
that is a bummer of '84. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I have a lot to unpack about this film, so forgive me, but yeah, I'm going to go on a bit of a rant. I'm going to start by saying that the '80s is probably my favorite setting in film. I have a great deal of nostalgia for it. I grew up on 80s cartoons and of course Steven Spielberg movies and et cetera. We're working on a film that is highly inspired by that sort of thing. I think that I am my truest self when I'm painting saccharine colors, listening to 80s electro and new retro wave. Like that's my jam. I will also lead with a positive. I think the soundtrack was very good for this movie. Beyond that, I had a world of problems. I went into this film not seeing any trailers, not knowing anything about it, other than it is called Summer of '84. It's clearly set in the '80s and an homage to the '80s. I was very, very disappointed from that point on. And I don't have very high expectations for that genre either, I don't think. I just, if anything, I tend to have pretty rose-colored glasses for it, and try to be very forgiving of it. And again, Mandy was my favorite film last year, or next to Annihilation. I love that genre.
I don't think Mandy is terribly '80s, but it is definitely neon. You know?
I think Mandy's extremely 80s. I think that all the references to it, all the homages are built out of the 80s, and it's set in the 80s. All the monsters and the action sequences are inspired by 80s action films.
But from a filmmaking standpoint, it takes a very modern approach to filmmaking.
The pacing is very modern.
Yeah, so in that sense, like I agree with both of you. Like it's definitely 80s inspired, but it's like an updated take on the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas something like Stranger Things or Summer of '84 is much more like directly trying to rip off the 80s.
You know, this is kind of a trend at this point, just doing 80s pastiche movies with
it's a
kids.
Bandwagon, yeah.
You know, between
Stephen King mania,
Stranger Things, and it, you know, it's a common thing.
Which it's one I'm here for.
I will say I thought this movie did a pretty solid job with that, because it felt very authentic in a way some of those don't necessarily feel, where it felt like it could have come out of that time.
I strongly disagree.
Especially narratively, in a way where it felt Spielbergian, and it felt very influenced by people like Joe Dante or Chris Colombo. Sure, the characters can be a little, you know, on the nose, but these are the people who did Turbo Kid. You know, they aren't necessarily subtle filmmakers, and knowing they did Turbo Kid going in made me forgive some of that, I think, a little bit more, because I think this movie in comparison to Turbo Kid is pretty nuanced.
I have not seen Turbo Kid. I remember watching the Red Letter Media video on it, and it seemed intriguing. My problem with this is the time that they decided to make this movie, because I kept trying to not make Stranger Things comparisons, and I couldn't. It felt so much like the Walmart brand of Stranger Things. It's like, okay, like I get what you're doing, but the name brand does it better, you know. And I could not stop. I kept trying. I'm like, no, this is a separate thing. This is not Stranger Things. This is not it. It's its own entity. I kept trying to give it the benefit of the doubt, and I just couldn't.
Yeah, I remember saying as much halfway through the film too. Like I was like, oh, you know, I need to stop trying to compare this to Stranger Things. But the unfortunate fact is this film does not exist in a vacuum, and it's very difficult to do that. Yeah. I would also like to bring up that I have seen Turbo Kid. And I very much so enjoyed that film. I thought it was a great fun movie, and also Turbo Kid, you know? which and also I didn't know that they directed that. They also directed Turbo Kid until you brought it up just now, and I find that really interesting because Turbo Kid was actually kind of on the front line of the 80s bandwagon. Like they were doing it a little bit before like everyone else, and before Stranger Things, and before the and new retro wave was even that much of a thing, like as a genre of music. Like it's fairly early into that, and I was much more willing to be forgiving of the problems that Turbo Kid had, because I think that movie, it looks like they had a lot of fun making it, and it's a fun film to be along the ride for. And it's a lot easier, I think, to be forgiving of that film. But this movie, my problems that I had with it were less easy to forgive. But Ben, it seems like you have something you want to say.
Yeah, well, I think with Turbo Kid, and we'll go back into Summer of '84, but Turbo Kid, I really liked it as well. I thought it was an excellent movie. But in a way, that movie feels very inauthentically 80s. Like it's very pastiche. It takes from a lot of things without feeling necessarily like something pinpointed. And this, whereas Summer of '84, it feels more of a concrete, you know, example of like The Burbs or Monster Squad or one of those type of group of kids, 80s mystery movies almost.
I can see how you would feel like this film, it feels less displaced. The thing that where I would prefer Turbo Kid is actually in that regard. I think Turbo Kid does something different. It has that kind of like modern, kind of like that indie feel to it that gave it its own sort of creative validation. It's clearly standing on the shoulders of larger giants like Mad Max and the like, and it had a much lower budget than those movies. But there was something very cute about that. It had been very indie and fun. And it was very forgivable. And I think that its creativity was a strong point, and that its differences helped set it aside. Where it's like, oh, cool, they're paying homage to Mad Max. It's clearly a love letter to those movies, but they are doing their own thing with it. Whereas this film, I felt was actually a pretty poor example of homage. I didn't think that it did anything to make it its own. Any of the remarks, especially like there are several times in the dialogue where in one sentence they just like the kids are saying like, "Hey, what if Ewoks and Gremlins though? You remember these movies that are better?"
Right. No.
Like,
I was gonna say the same thing. This actually, this movie, in a lot of ways, feels inauthentically 80s to me, in the respect that it doesn't trust itself to just exist in the 80s. It has to constantly,
or trust the audience to remember it.
Yeah, that it has to constantly be referencing the 80s in really heavy-handed ways. Like another one of the scenes where they're hanging out in the treehouse and they're sort of making fun of the protagonist because he's a truther, and it's like, oh, remember the time you hooked your light bright up to your MIDI keyboard to communicate with extraterrestrials, or that you told us that our houses are all built on Indian burial grounds. It's like, hey, remember Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and hey, remember Poltergeist?
Yeah. Hey, remember these better movies?
In the same sentence. And then later the kid whose dad is like a cameraman for the news, and he's like, hey, can I use such and such? He's like, no, that's the station's equipment. And the kid's like, how am I ever gonna be the next Spielberg if I don't such and such? It's like, okay.
Yeah,
we get it.
Yeah, the film has a huge like hard on for like 80s culture and those films, but it doesn't bring anything new to the table. It just asks you to remember those other films you could be watching. And meanwhile, and again, I as much as I want to avoid Stranger Things comparatives, I think there isn't a choice. And Stranger Things, whenever it does have its product placement, and in some cases has the same ones, they're generally background, or they are built in organically. For instance, something that both these films do is they have the Reagan Bush signs in the front yard. This Summer of '84 has direct shots where someone puts down the sign and it focuses on it for a second, and the cinematography is just shouting, "Hey, remember this? Remember these?" And there's nothing else built on that. It doesn't have anything to do with the characterization. It doesn't, like, we don't learn the political motives of those parents or say like, "Oh yeah, they totally would be Reagan Bush."
I mean, I disagree. That's the family that were fighting all the time that the rebel kid was from,
Right, but we don't, other than the fact that we hear his parents arguing from outside the house, and that his brother's a douchebag and he's edgy, like there's never any other development into his home life or where that character comes from or why.
Yeah, and again, the primary issue I have with it isn't even necessarily the justification. It's I don't think there was no, it is both. I don't think there was enough justification. There was some, but there was definitely not enough to have it be such a centralized moment. Like, the camera hangs on it for a good while, and it just says like, "Hey, remember this." And meanwhile, it is in the background in Stranger Things. It is a secondary prop.
Yeah,
for instance,
set dressing.
And there's another sequence in Stranger Things, for instance, when they're sitting down with Barb's family, and I can't remember the kid's name, but he says like, "Hey man, that was finger licking good." And the family laughs at that. And that's one of the most heavy-handed moments in Stranger Things. But even in that sequence, it feels organic. That's something that someone would say at that time.
That's something
they would show that, like the
KFC commercials would be.
That's the thing.
Yeah, and he says it sarcastically almost too, which is fun. Like,
that's the reason. One of the reasons on the flip side that I'm not terribly bothered by how many referential stuff they have in this movie in terms of the dialogue is because, like, if you listen to teenagers and kids of that age, like, they are just referencing movies all the time.
Yes, that is very true.
Especially at the time.
Yeah, when we were kids, we did the same thing. We would say, "Hey, what if Ewoks and Gremlins?"
But
I agree with that.
It doesn't feel natural in their dialogue in the movie and the stuff that they're talking about.
See,
it feels shoehorned.
I disagree. I felt like it felt somewhat authentic. And on the flip side, on the in respects to the product placement, Reagan Bush stuff, I think if they would have, given that more explanation, it would have felt more heavy-handed. I like how minimal it is. I think the idea that it's this, rebel kid from a conservative, dysfunctional household is enough to build that character without it feeling...
I would say it's enough, but the cinematography made it too much.
Well, that's what
made it...
Yeah.
I have a problem with how heavy-handed it was.
It's not that I needed more development on why they had the Reagan Bush
I agree that would be too much.
It's the fact that the way that part was shot is that they had to hang on it to be like, oh, make sure we see it.
Yeah.
If it had just been in the background and something you pick up, it's like, oh, they got a Reagan Bush sign. That's, like Cleveland saying, that's something that Stranger Things does really well. It's the fact that they had to make it a point to linger on that and be like, oh, look, Reagan Bush, 80s.
Mm-hmm. Now, I do have another point that I think will give Ben some justification to, and that is a lot of the awkward sort of moments or the artificial aspects of this film are somewhat justified in that they are shot and set to feel like an 80s film, which Stranger Things doesn't necessarily do. Stranger Things has very modern pacing, and it tries to bring as much realism into itself as it can.
Sure.
Whereas a lot of those Steven Spielberg films from that same era do feel very artificial in a way that this film captures. And so it is trying to do something different from a directorial standpoint than Stranger Things is. And I think it does succeed on that front. Like, it does feel like it was shot it feels like it was directed in the 80s, where Stranger Things doesn't. It feels like it's set in the 80s. I think that the modern approach is more effective, personally, but I do see what they're doing there. My issue is that they don't do anything else. They don't bring anything new to the table beyond that. It is only a love letter to a degree that I found very boring. It's something I'd seen before, and it didn't give me anything. And if anything, I'd seen it better done. There were several good ideas in this film, but they never were brought to fruition, and there was nothing very creative. There was nothing to me creative about this film. It was all structured around homages. It was all structured around that. But even then, to the degree where it was like, hey, this is a cliche from the 80s, but that's all it is. Right. And there were entire scenes that played out that way, where I would be sitting there being like, cool, I've seen this before.
That's
I know what you're doing. I know what's happening.
There was nothing.
Give me something.
There was nothing for me in this movie that I had not seen done better by something else. That was ultimately the problem. It's not like it was completely incompetent. In fact, in terms of like what it does, it is competent. But the problem is that it's not bringing anything new or interesting. Everything that it does, like, okay, I see what you're doing, but this does it better.
And even in the way that it's compiled together, that has been done before. Like, that's the other thing for me, is like, even just saying like, oh, hey, what if we strung all of these 80s tropes together? Would that be enough to make it original and new? My answer is no. Like, I don't think it is.
I'll disagree with you somewhat. I think you made a really good point where Stranger Things and it, have the stylistic pastiche of 80s movies while having a very modern approach to that. This feels much more authentically an 80s movie. And in addition, I think in my opinion, the shortcomings of a lot of, the Stranger Thing, it type of things is the two big things I have a slight problem with is a reliance on sentimentality with kids and a trapping of the supernatural, which this movie does not do either. You could argue that it's somewhat sentimental, but I don't think it's ever overly heavy-handed. But ultimately, on top of that, I think the originality and the strength is from how interesting the police officer's plot is. I think the Mackie himself is probably the strongest actor in the movie.
I agree with that.
Yeah, no, I'll agree with you 100%
and I think
there.
he, in a lot of ways, his nuance and characterization carries a lot of this movie.
Oh, he definitely carries it.
And he brings the dread into this movie. And I think in a lot of ways, that is what is original in the movie for me. And I think the darkness of all of that, especially in the third act, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is what really makes this movie, you know, above and beyond just your standard, you know, 80s affair.
Before we get into Mackie, because I think that he's probably going to be the bulk of our conversation and the plot around him, I do want to quickly jump back to your point on sentimentality. I will agree with you in everything except for one aspect that I found disgustingly sentimental, and that was the relationship with the neighbor girl who they all have a crush on.
Yeah.
I thought that was grossly sentimental, and also gross because she seems to have a thing for him, and she's 18 and he's like 15.
Yeah.
That whole thing was, oh no, I did not like that.
I think, yeah, it really culminated into just a big ball of shittiness for me when they're peeping on her and they're rewarded for it.
Right.
Like, that's where I really felt like the first time that I really felt like the directors and writers were just jacking themselves
like
off.
They're constantly objectifying her in a way that is not unreasonable for kids their age, but the fact that they focus on it so much and that the writers reward that by her kissing the main character later, after like the entire first half of the movie is them talking about like what they would do to her sexually, and like they would get her pregnant, and like spying on her through the window as she's undressing.
It's very masturbatory, it's the directors engaging in their own like fucked fantasy.
I think it's the weakest subplot in the movie, but I will say it does feel authentically 80s. That would be in an 80s movie.
Sure, but
that doesn't mean it's a good thing.
Well, I think,
but that does fit in the time period of movies.
But I will agree with you there. But that being said, this is a film that was made in 2017, 2018, and it's not an 80s film. And you can pick and choose what aspects of 80s films that you want to have in your movie, and you don't have to have the super 80s perviness. You can do it in a way that feels more innocent with kids, like horny teenagers. There's plenty of ways to do that without it actually like skeeving out the viewer
and paying off
and rewarding them for their perviness.
Right.
Like, I understand it's an aspect of the 80s, but whereas something we were talking about with like Silent Night, Deadly Night, and the what Cleveland would consider the glorification of rape and the way that it's shot, it's like, okay, that is problematic, but that was a film that was made in the 80s. So it's like you can look at it through that lens where, yeah, it's gross, but it's like, consider the time period.
Still not justified.
Still not justified,
Absolutely
but this is
not.
But this is a film, this is a modern film, and they still chose to do that.
I mean, that is a very valid point, and I won't argue that subplot was pretty weak. What I will say is, like, you look at some 80s movies that have those kind of subplots in them, and they're even worse.
Sure.
You know?
Sure.
So, like...
It still doesn't bring any justification to me, yeah.
Considering it is subdued in comparison, especially since they give her character a little more screen time and nuance in their conversations. But I will say some of that stuff at the beginning is a little...
Because here's the thing. When those things were happening in the film, I was skeezed by them and I had a problem with them, but I was also open to there being a different kind of payoff that would justify those things.
Well, right. The thing that confused and bothered me the most was her developing relationship with the main character over the course of the film,
which is also entirely arbitrary.
It is. It has no real payoff. But to establish at the beginning that like she was his babysitter, and that she's obviously older. It's established that she's going off to Stanford in the fall. She's moving. So she is of college age. She's a young adult, and he's a 15-year-old. They're pubescent teens, and she starts like developing like an almost romantic relationship with him.
She just does, yeah. Like,
yeah, and like, and she like
that.
she wants to hang out with him. She wants to drink with him. Like, she wants him to sneak over to her house so they can talk. Oh, I don't have any friends in this town except for you, a 15-year-old boy. And, like, that stuff all just didn't... It wasn't believable, first of all. And it was also a little creepy. I didn't really like any of that.
Yeah, this film, I found it did nothing to... It never once threw my expectations, personally. I think that... I found the characters to be milquetoast from beginning to end. All the characters are the archetypes that they are, and they maintain those throughout the film. There's no arc.
That's the thing. Something that I noticed very early on is the 4 kids are the exact same as the 4 kids from Stand By Me.
Hey, do you remember Stand By Me? It's a really good film.
They fit the exact same archetypes. Main character in this is the main character in Stand By Me. The Corey Feldman is the nerdy glasses kid in this movie. The fat kid is the fat kid, and the rebellious kid is the River Phoenix character.
Except less developed across the board.
Well,
right,
I would definitely
likable.
agree that they're archetypal, but I think the reason it works somewhat for me is there's a dark veneer under the surface that, you know, they hint on throughout.
Yeah, but wouldn't you say that Stand By Me has the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Done better, I mean, think.
Yes, but between the Mackie stuff and the third act, I think that stuff for me is forgiven a little bit more, just because they're trying to play into those standards and then reverse the table on you.
Except, was the table ever reversed? The theory at the beginning of the film is that Mackie's the killer, and that is maintained throughout the entire film.
And then it does turn out to be true, to the point that I was thinking throughout a lot of the movie, I'm like, they're laying on so heavy-handedly that Mackie is the serial killer that it's going to turn out to not be him. I was thinking it's got to be somebody different. They have to be wrong because they set it up so early and then they don't. It's still,
and not in a way that defies expectation.
I think the reversing of the table comes in the last 15 minutes, but let's wait to talk about that until we talk a little bit more about Mackie.
Yeah, okay.
Because I think Mackie was the strongest character in this movie.
Definitely.
And
I would go as far as to say the only competent actor in the film, but I'm sure, you know.
I mean, I don't think the kids were the worst actors.
I absolutely did, yeah. The editing didn't help. When you have a second of pausing between each piece of dialogue, I felt like the editor... Sorry to interrupt you, Ben. I felt like the editor had almost a 1-second rule, where anytime someone said something, there was a 1-second pause before the next line queued up, which just let any poorly delivered line or mediocre line just hang in the air. And it... and again, that is how a lot of films from that time were edited, but also better acted in. The Goonies has pretty fun acting in it. It's not terrible, and these kids were nowhere near as on par as the actors in those films.
I didn't find the acting of the kids all that bad. It didn't feel that much worse than the Goonies acting or Monster Squad or something like that.
I think another problem is that I think that they're extremely weak actors in comparison to the kids from Stranger Things or from It.
And their characters are also written so much more weakly as well.
Yeah, and I mean, that's also just... I mean, at least for Stranger Things. Stranger Things is long-form storytelling, so they have a lot of time to develop their characters. But yeah, I think that the only kid that I liked out of the 4 of them was the fat kid, and he dies.
Mm-hmm. And even then, again, in the Goonies, the characters, their archetypes change. They have lessons, and they become better selves by the end of the movie. They stand up to their fears or deal with their problems in some way. And in this film, they just stay the same.
Yeah, I wouldn't say any of these kids really have arcs, except in the fact that towards the end of the movie, angsty kid and glasses kid, for virtually no reason, decide to abandon their other friends.
Yeah, which was weird. But here, we've interrupted Ben's point long enough. I'll let you finish.
Let's talk about Mackie.
I thought Mackie was really strong, and I don't think the kids are all that weak, in my opinion. I think going back to even some of the more problematic stuff, I felt like that stuff worked to make the kids feel less saccharine than they do in things like Stranger Things. And to an extent, it does it a little better than Stranger Things, but they feel like, actual kids that are having, vulgar conversations. I mean, that's what middle schoolers do.
Yeah, that's true. But
and I felt like that was a little more authentic. But I think more than anything, they were a vehicle to showcase Mackie in a lot of ways, because I think the way Mackie is played as this kind of creep that you don't quite know if they're doing a bait and switch on you or not throughout the whole movie works really well for me, because you go through the whole movie expecting them to do like a fake out on you,
right,
and you almost are trying to guess who it's going to be if not Mackie.
But who else could it be? Who else do they present in the film that it could be other than the girlfriend? That's the only other like secondary or periphery character who could be the serial killer. Like, it can't really be a whodunit if there's only one or maybe two people who could have done it.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think that it would have been better if they had put more red herrings in the film, because it's like the way they approach it, it does make you think surely it has to be somebody else, but they don't present anybody.
There
else
is no one else it could be. Yeah.
So I'm like. So,
even like a mailman, literally nothing.
I felt like they were just going to introduce a new character who was the killer at the end, and then it still just turns out to be Mackie. And it's like, okay, that's what you've been telling us from 10 minutes into the movie up till this point. Why is that satisfying for me to have that confirmation?
I think if anything, the fake out would be them just not discovering who the
but it's a movie. Like, that's not gonna happen. Like, that's they're never gonna discover the killer.
I think they even almost set it up to imply that there were two killers at one point, but that turned out to just be bad editing, I think, because like you have the scene where like the new kid who we never learn anything about is walking home at night, and he turns around and sees somebody, and we hear heavy footsteps, and he gets scared and he runs and he turns down an alley, and then he gets grabbed from behind him off camera, and I was like, oh, there might be two killers, because how did the killer get from here to over here in that time? Like, oh, there's multiple killers. And then there wasn't. I was like, oh, well, that's
my thing is, I wasn't even like, oh, there might be multiple killers. I was like, oh, there might be multiple killers. Why did I feel that way? Because I wasn't in any way tied to that person. Who is this random person getting killed off? Or taken, actually. And like, I mean, there's nothing I hadn't seen before in that sequence either. It was a person I didn't have any direct reference to, so I had no concern for, just being, like, vanished. Why am I worried for this person? He's just a mechanism, like, for the killer. I found little to no tension for the majority of the film, or any worry for these characters. Because it feels like, because we don't know if their fear over Mackie is justified. So you don't really know, like, okay, are these kids actually scared of this guy or not? Or did these kids have a reason to be scared of this guy? Probably, but we don't know that. And, or are these kids just fucking up? I was kind of hoping that the film might take an arc where the kids were actually the problem, and that the serial killer maybe wasn't anybody, and that the kids were just fucking up this guy's life for no reason, which I think could make for a very funny premise.
I agree.
And I think it would make for a better premise.
That's what I kind of meant with them not finding the actual serial killer being the possible twist that I was almost expecting.
You'd find the serial killer. You just find the serial killer to not be Mackie, and that the kids were just fucking up this guy's life. Like, and I think that is still a type of payoff.
Yeah, I think that's.
And I think it's a better payoff.
When I was watching the movie, I wanted them to be wrong about Mackie so much, because I mean, let's just be honest. Like, these kids are kind of little shitheads.
Yeah.
Like,
and
I didn't really like
other
them
film
very much. Like, I wanted them to be wrong.
Yeah.
I didn't want them to be justified in what they were doing. And so in that sense, the fact that Mackie does turn out to be the serial killer like they've been telling us for the whole movie, it felt unsatisfying, because I wanted I wanted there to be that
Yeah,
bait and switch.
and it says like, hey, it's okay to spy on your neighbors because they might be serial killers. It's like, well, no, you shouldn't fucking spy on your neighbors. And like they reward shitty behavior so many times in this film. To what end?
I don't know. I think it reminded me in a way of like Rear Window almost. And, you know, it's kind of a slow discovery of things that might be up, but not being 100% sure. I like the slow discovery of things like the shed and the MTV shirt in the back, setting up the radios, him putting it in the window because he found it, them kind of looking through the upper window while playing Manhunt. I thought all of that stuff was interesting enough to keep me invested in it.
I think the difference with something like Rear Window is in like Rear Window you have the aspect of Jimmy Stewart being crippled, so he's the amount of information that he can glean is limited entirely to what he's able to see out his window, so it leaves a lot more room for doubt. Whereas in this movie, the movie never presents there being any real doubt that Mackie is the killer. The only reason that you do doubt is because it's so heavy-handed in its certainty that Mackie is the killer that it seems too certain.
Well,
But then
think,
it just
I think
is.
The main character's certainty is in contention because he is so into conspiracies, you know? Like, you are following that kid's viewpoint directly.
Right, which again has been done before. Like, oh,
In
you've
what?
read too many comic books as a kid. I mean, that's a
What, like,
cliche.
it is a...
Like that's forgiven in many horror movies from that time period. You know, to the point
Like
where again,
what?
like let me think of some examples off the top of my head. What are some films where the characters say, "Oh, you've read too many comic books"? Oh, you, like I know I've heard that several times.
I think another example of a movie that does something similar but not nearly as well as this movie would be like Disturbia, which is, you know,
which
like
is just Rear Window.
Rear Window essentially, except Shia LaBeouf is not disabled in it, you know?
Yeah, but he can't leave the house because of the ankle bracelet. So it's the same conceit, but also Disturbia is literally just a ripoff of Rear Window.
Yes.
And I haven't seen Disturbia. I have no doubt that it's
Same.
not a very good movie. But I think it is the exact same conceit as Rear Window. Let's talk about the last part. Let's get into that because we still have a whole other movie to talk about after this. And I don't want us to go in circles too much.
Mm-hmm.
You seem like you had some things you wanted to say about the third act.
I was a little worried about this movie right near the end because the kids, while Mackie is at a festival parade thing after he's captured the serial killer,
Right.
They break into his house and go into his basement, and they discover a dead body in the bathroom and a bunch of pictures of his victims.
And the kid who was kidnapped earlier.
Yeah, the
also in
kid who was
bathroom.
kidnapped in the bathroom, and they had taken his dad's video camera,
Right,
and they
and
shoot the whole thing, and it ties it all up so cleanly. They present it to the police, and obviously they're like, "Oh man, I guess he was the killer all along." And I was just like, "Oh no, is that how they're gonna end it? Just this cleanly?" Like,
I was afraid of that,
His
too.
love interest is like, my parents were smiling.
Oh,
together.
fuck
Oh yeah,
me, I
they
hated
hugged
that.
each other.
I
Yeah,
hated
hugged each
that
other.
so
I was
much.
like, "Oh no, is that what they're gonna do?"
I mean, they still
And then-
did that. Like that still happened.
Well, okay,
That
but-
moment. I know what you mean about the closing.
but
But
I
that
will
scene.
say-
Sorry.
It doesn't end
It
happily.
doesn't
Yeah.
end like that, which is what I'm thankful for.
I agree.
That character's arc, though. Yeah.
I agree. I see.
well,
I
even
thought
with the girl, because
I thought
see
she
her
was
at the
going to
very
get killed
end.
after that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Well, no, but just that scene happened at all was unfortunate to me. Like her, it was just so artificial and so. Oh yeah, my parents might be getting back together because of this arbitrary thing that has nothing to do with my parents.
See, I think that strengthens the very end, though, in a way, because it makes it feel even darker, because it wraps it up so cleanly that the darkness is almost more unexpected. So after that all happens, you know, Mackie is still at large, and they go back to the house, and the fat kid is staying with the main character because his mom is a drunk. And also because he wants to be safe.
I don't think she's a drunk. She's a single mom, and she works incredibly long shifts at the hospital.
Yeah, that's mostly what.
And from
it
a
is.
mechanism, like from like a real world sense, it makes sense too. Because like if your kid is like dealt with that kind of trauma, you want to be around his other friends,
right?
So like
and
he feels.
I bring up the point about his mom because it'll lead into something after this. But continue.
Yes. So they're staying together, and it turns out Mackie is hiding in their attic, and while everyone is asleep, he kidnaps the two kids.
Which how?
Yeah, there are police guards out front, and it just cuts away.
And also, how did he like that? The fat kid is big, like he's like close to my size. Like, how did Mackie single-handedly kidnap the main character and his big tubby friend and get them out of the house into his car, his police cruiser?
The fat kid,
without anybody noticing.
The fat kid was clearly the oldest actor of the children, to the point where they even felt the need to allude to it in the writing, where the kids just say like, "Oh, you look like you're 30 anyway."
Well, because they steal his mom's car.
So it's like he's a big kid. He's a big dude. Yeah, and like, how do you get both of those children like out of the house? Like again, there are police guarding out front, and it's another moment where they kind of, I feel like they didn't really know how to pick their tone with this character, because just like in the kill scene or the kidnapping scene with the unknown kid, they just break physics. It's like, oh, he's just suddenly behind him. Oh, he just gets them out of the house. Who cares how?
Like that kid easily weighs 200 pounds, and I would challenge anybody, no matter how strong they are, to carry something that is 200 pounds out of a house downstairs
past a police escort
without making any noise.
Well, the police escort, at that time of the night wasn't necessarily there, and
no, they were shown to be there.
Yeah, we saw them outside the window.
Earlier in the night.
I mean, they would have been staking out Mackie's house to see if he came home. Like, he was still on the lam. Like, they discovered
even when the kids go to bed, like, the police are, like, outside the window.
The police would be there keeping guard on the kids.
Like, they're set up to still be there.
They would expect Mackie to come back for those kids.
Yeah.
But regardless, that is just another thing that I think is sloppy, but it doesn't...
It doesn't bother me that much. They give a few outs with him having extra cars in that remote garage, that he can swap.
That's true.
That
Although
helped a little bit.
When they wake up and he has them out on the island in the woods, we do see that they're in his police
cruiser. If
cruiser.
anything, I would assume he just swapped the cars.
Could be.
And there's some outs that they give themselves, so it's not completely unbelievable. I will say the scene that follows it is arguably the best scene.
The best scene in the movie. Yeah, definitely.
He kidnaps them, takes them out to the woods, essentially just hunts them down as they run in the woods. They come across the pool of bodies that he has soaking in sodium hydroxide,
something like
peroxide.
that.
People melt in acid.
Yeah.
What I will say, I don't think his motivations for taking them out to that island are particularly well developed, but I think that sequence in general is pretty good. Specifically after he has killed the fat kid, which I hated because that was the only kid that I actually liked out of the
I
four.
wasn't expecting that to happen in this movie, though.
No, it's true.
Especially with how the rest of the movie played. It really pulled the rug out from under me.
I don't think I wasn't not expecting it. Sorry, that's a weird way to phrase it, but I feel like I was expecting
You were expecting an on-screen kill of a kid?
Not an on-screen kill, but I mean, the film's already like killed kids, like, so we just saw a whole series of children's corpses.
In that matter, though.
I mean, we just saw like a field of children's corpses, melting in acid.
In that scene, that.
Well, and we see the child's half-dissolved
me
corpse in the bathtub in the basement prior to that.
Like that has, for me, I think it has been established enough. I just didn't want it to happen. And I think that's the key difference.
I would have been fine with it with any other character. I just and maybe it's a good thing, but
I think that's the point. He's so likable.
I like that character, and like having him say before that, like, I can't die tonight. My mom needs me. I have to take care of my mom. We see that she's a single mom and that she's she's poor and that she's working so many hours to try to, provide for her and her son. And he's obviously has a sense of helplessness that he can't make it better for his mom. And right after we see that, we just see him get his throat cut on camera. And maybe that is the film doing a good job at making me feel something for characters that I otherwise wouldn't feel anything about.
Exactly.
Personally,
I think that's the point.
I don't think that really like changed justification, because in films, especially from the 80s and stuff, like you have usually if someone sets up that they have a wife and kids, like in a war movie, they're the ones who's going to die. If the cop's about to retire, he's going to be the one who dies. If they set up any kind of justification for the character's death being effective, then it's probably going to happen. They did that.
See,
and
here's the thing. I think the rest of the movie sets up that feeling of an 80s movie so well that with the last 15 minutes, it completely subverts that and takes it to a much darker place than you would see in that type of movie. And in that respect, I think it works because of it. I think having that dark kill, seeing it directly hits home so much. It makes you feel something. It's horrifying to watch. I mean, like, honestly, it's probably the scariest part of the movie, just because you feel for that character and you don't want him to die.
It is the one part of the movie that made me feel anything other than frustration, so I will give it kudos for that.
Yeah, I definitely think this is the strongest part of the movie, especially Mackie's monologue afterwards.
Yes,
I felt like that was a very effective scene, and I think it was not just the best scene in the movie, but again, personally, I think it was a really good scene in the movie. It was the only one that I really enjoyed.
I agree.
And I think it was way, way, way too late in the game to give me anything like that. But going back to, again, specifically the fat kid's throat being slit, my issue is that from a filmmaking perspective, it wasn't that original of a kill. It's a simple like blood drag. It's just, he pulls a knife across his throat and like there's just the blood on the back of on the back of the knife. Like, it's not.
Do you want like a meat grinder?
Yes. I wanted something that I hadn't seen before, and I've seen like that effect used. It's just like the simple, like they pull the knife across, like in the original Predator, like with Jesse Ventura, like when he cuts his face shaving, they had to like build a specifically designed like screw in like blood prop into the razor to like make it look like it's cutting his skin. Like films from that era like did some really incredible live effects, and this film and there's no originality in just slitting a throat.
I mean, I think in the stylistic trappings of this type of movie, the Monster Squads, the Burbs, even the Goonies, you wouldn't see something like that happen.
I think you would, though, in like maybe Nightmare on Elm Street or Jason, which also features
that's
like
a different type of movie entirely.
Yeah, that's true.
That's a completely different type of movie.
Here's one thing that isn't different, and that's the soundtrack. The soundtrack is very John Carpenter. I felt like when you're hearing that kind of soundtrack, it puts me in that place. It puts me in Nightmare on Elm Street, and it makes me want to see some Nightmare on Elm Street stuff. Like, and there is a monster threat, whether it's a serial killer or a paranormal entity. It's the same mechanism. There is an outsider threat, and it's killing off these people, and you have to try and stop it and get to the bottom of it. I felt like the score reinforced that, and again, also, I just wanted something new with this film, something creative, and those sorts of monster films from that same era give you that. They give you something iconic and powerful, and I think that Mackie was effective, but I don't think he was as effective as those other things.
See, I completely disagree with you, because I think those movies are much different, even with the soundtrack. I mean, you look at something like Monster Squad or The Burbs, and they have similar soundtracks, but they're not relying on a supernatural force. Mackie is played pretty straight throughout, and with the end, it really subverts the coming of age discovery trope of those films and takes it to a much darker place, to the benefit, I think, of the rest of the film. Because I think it makes you reconsider some of the other events earlier in the movie and look at them from a bit of a different perspective.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but what I will say is I do appreciate the subversion of, like you said, the coming of age and like the kids saving the day, which they definitely do not. We see that Mackie is still on the run. He told the main character that as much as he wants to kill him, he's going to let him live in fear for a while, and then when you least expect me, I'm going to be there and I'm going to fucking kill you.
I thought that monologue was incredible.
It was excellent.
It was very good.
Live in fear. I liked that, and that we see him, doing his paper route at the end. His one friend is dead. They're tearing down the tree house. His other two friends won't look him in the eye. He sees his love interest leaving in the car to go off to college. He's probably not going to see her again. All of that, I think, especially because I fucking hated the protagonist so much for the entirety of the movie, that to see his life in shambles at the end of the movie
kind of gratifying.
Was really satisfying for me.
It's such a downer ending, and I love it because it subverts all those expectations of that styling.
My problem is it's just too little too late.
My bit is I didn't feel subverted because by the time the kids have made it back to their home and they're going to sleep and everything has just been given this perfect bow on top of it, the bow is too clearly perfect. I didn't feel subverted when Mackie came down from the attic. I thought the idea was kind of fun and very 80s, like him hiding in the attic the whole time. Yeah. But I didn't feel subverted. I didn't not expect that. Mackie's still out. He's still loose, but everything else has been so clearly put. Like the bow was so big that they put on top of the script at that point to say, like, look, it's all done except for he's kind of still on the loose. Everything's fine. Get ready to roll credits. Oh wait, we're not rolling the credits. Well, yeah, of course you're not rolling the credits.
Well, I mean, the downer ending is definitely a subversion, though.
Yeah, the real ending.
Even a movie like this where that saccharine ending isn't the true ending, they would still have the main character overcome in the end, which really doesn't happen in this movie.
which is what I do appreciate about the movie, is that it at least subverts it in that respect at the end. But for me, it was just too little too late, because I didn't enjoy the rest of the ride particularly.
Right.
So that, at least it ended in a somewhat satisfying way, but the whole movie was still so boring and uninspired for me. I'm gonna go ahead and rate this just because we gotta move on.
Yeah.
It had more problems than pros for me. I understand where you're coming from with a lot of it. It was not to my personal tastes, and it had enough frustrating things about it that it was not a particularly enjoyable viewing experience for me. I've definitely seen worse, so it wasn't god awful, but I'm gonna give it a 2 out of 5 pods, which means I actually have to update my bottom 5 of 2018 from last week, because this movie knocked the Cloverfield Paradox out of my bottom 5, and this movie replaced it.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, but that's just me. So 2 out of 5 pods for me.
Yeah, well, I like this movie a lot more than both of you. I think it's fairly strong at what it does. It more than any other 80s styling movie, it feels authentically 80s in its execution more than a lot of those. I think Mackie is a really strong, interesting character, and the way that stuff unfolds, especially in the third act, is pretty strong. I do agree that, some of the archetypes are very generic in a way, but that didn't bother me all that much. Ultimately, I'm going to give this a 4 out of 5.
Wow,
I think it was pretty strong.
All right, Cleve?
Yeah. No, I feel that, like, Mackie's piece of dialogue at the very end was effective, but the problem I had is that was the rest of the film. I felt that the whole what was this 2.5 hours long? How long was it? 2 hours?
An hour 50.
Sorry, it felt
an hour 50. Yeah.
Yeah, like the series of scenes that I'd just seen before in film, the dialogue, the set dressing, all of it was something I had seen as done before to the degree that it really, really hampered my experience. I felt very little tension or concern for any of the characters near the entirety of the experience. And I felt it to personally, I found it to be very milquetoast. And there would be only any kind of payoff or tension at the very end of the film. I wish there had been some more sequences leading up to it. I think that there were plenty of opportunities to have that with like the kid who was kidnapped. That's the only like kind of kill scene we get before the very end, and even then it's just a kid running down a street and then gets like taken off screen, and that's it. Like there was nothing there for me. I found it to be very void. And again, the question of who the killer is only confirmed, and there are little to no red herrings to bring that into question when it comes to ambiguity. Yeah, I'm gonna give it a 2 as well. I found so little to like out of almost the entirety of this film. Yeah, I'm giving it a 2.
All right, well, that will give Summer of '84 an average of 2.7 out of 5 pods. Also, let us know your thoughts on this, because this is one where we're clearly divided, and I don't think there is a right or wrong answer, so I'd be curious to hear some other people's thoughts.
Sure.
So hit us up on Twitter and let us know what you thought of that. All right, the final film that we're going to be talking about today is called The Endless, directed, written, and also starring Aaron Moorhead and Justin Benson, about 2 escapees from a doomsday cult who receive a tape from the cult that sort of convinces them to go back for a visit. And weirdness ensues. I will go ahead and say that I really, really liked this movie a lot overall.
There was a lot of stuff to like in this movie.
Much more so than I was expecting. It is my particular brand of horror that I like most, in that it is very Lovecraftian horror, fear of the unknown, to the extent that they even open the film with a quote from H.P. Lovecraft about the greatest fear being the fear of the unknown, immediately followed by another quote that is attributed to unknown, which I liked a lot.
That was very funny.
I thought that was very tongue-in-cheek. Yeah, so Cleveland and I have talked about this movie together quite a bit, so I'm curious to hear your initial thoughts, Ben, before Cleveland and I weigh in.
I thought it was really pretty solid. There are a couple problems I had with it. I think the movie at its strongest is when it is subtle.
Yes.
A lot of times throughout the movie, you have kind of a slow burn of them as they go back to the cult and get reacquainted with a lot of people there, and the interactions they have with other people are really interesting. All of the characters of the cult members are really interesting and well developed, and I thought that was really strong. My biggest problem was when they show stuff, whether it's the underwater kind of shape in the water,
sure. Above when they do the shot from above,
or the mirrored moons. Some of that stuff it really showed its budget more than anything else.
Yeah,
and I
100%.
think that's its biggest shortcoming.
I had a big footnote.
If they played that a little more subtle, it would have come off even stronger.
Yeah, I think what we can sort of blanket say about this movie is that in terms of storytelling, it does a really good job. At least I think so. But its shortcomings are, for the most part, limited to what they were able to do with CG, and when it kind of takes you out of it. Because I think their ideas and their concepts, and even the pacing and the way that they lay out the characters and the story and what you're discovering as you go along, is incredibly strong.
It's primo, yeah.
But it's just at times, like you said, they show too much, and it's like, ooh, that CG does not look very great. That takes me out of it.
Yeah, no, Ben, I'm really glad you said that. I had a footnote where I was gonna bring up those exact same points. Like, yeah, this film has a budget problem for sure, and definitely their eyes were bigger than their stomach.
Well, let's get into the characters and the narrative a little bit before we get too much into that. Just so we can set the scene a little bit. So the directors play the 2 main characters, who are brothers, who, when they were children, they were in a car accident and their mother died, and they were found by these people from the cult, and they were essentially raised in the cult. and then they ran away when they thought that they were all going to commit suicide. Such and such. They've been gone for 10 years. The younger brother doesn't like their life outside of the cult because they're struggling. He's like, everything was good when we were there. Why don't we go back? I want to see my friends again. And the older brother's like, no, they're crazy people. Like, they were going to kill themselves, like, and us too. He's much more so the pragmatic realist character with the responsibility of, I have to take care of my younger brother.
Yeah, well, in a lot of ways you have the skeptic and the believer archetypes, and some of that isn't super developed, but I think their interactions with everyone else in this world is where the strengths go.
Well, and how the two of them interact differently with the members of the cult.
Yeah.
Because the older brother acquiesces to taking the younger brother back for a visit. He's like, if we go back and see it, will you like chill and let us like go back to our normal lives? We'll go back for a night. And the way that they interact with the members of the cult is very different, because we see the cult as this very idealized commune kind of place. They make their money by brewing beer. Everybody in the commune has their own roles, what they do. They're all very happy. They're all very welcoming. They're not particularly culty all the time, but then they'll do things where the older brother will be like, that's really culty. You see what I'm talking about here?
Yeah. One thing I liked about the beginning of the film is that I was immediately put off by the quirks that the brothers had. I felt they were very strange characters, and I think it was to the
point that it almost felt like bad acting.
Yeah, like it was like, oh, this acting is really weird. Like they're doing some weird things. It feels kind of artificial. I remember we had a moment where we said that to each other, T. So it was like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this yet, but let's see how it plays out. And we're almost immediately rewarded. It's very intentional, and I think it's done well. I've met people like that in real life.
Well, yeah, you start to realize that the reason they're behaving strangely is because they were raised in a cult.
Yeah.
They were conditioned, so they don't understand the real world. It's also they talk about a lot that they don't know how to interact with people outside of the cult. They've lived out of the cult for 10 years, but they haven't been able to make friends. They haven't been able to meet women. It's established that they're both virgins in their 30 or in their late 20s, Like, they're completely unable to properly exist outside of the cult.
Which I think is excellent. Like, I think it's a very ballsy move to have two protagonists that are essentially that hard to relate to in a social context, and you don't see that very often. And it was done extremely well. I think it was a risky move, and I think it did pay off. Having the brothers be kind of hard to get a hold of at the beginning.
Yeah.
To an extent. I don't think they're the strongest characters in this movie, but that's fine because we viewed the actions of the movie through the lens of them. So they're almost a vessel for watching the movie more so than the most fleshed out characters in the movie.
I think they play as foils to each other very well. They might not be the most interesting or developed characters, but they're two sides of a coin, so they almost exist better as a combined character.
Yeah, I think that
you can't really have one without the other.
I think that they are well. I think they're well enough acted. They're well enough established. They're well enough developed. I think that there are some other characters in this film that are like more intriguing and more interesting and maybe better acted. Yeah. But I think that overall there was nothing wrong in that sense.
I will agree that like when the movie started, I was a little worried too because the acting was off. Yeah. And I also thought the aesthetic, especially in the first like 20 minutes, was kind of weird. It's like a weirdly digital aesthetic to it.
It felt like a student film in a lot of ways.
Yeah. It was all desaturated and kind of I don't want to say ugly, but it was kind of ugly aesthetic.
A little bit.
Yeah. The editing too. Like
I will say that I grew to like it.
I grew to like it once they got to the cult, I think. Mm-hmm. Before that, I had a hard time with it, but it grew on me after long enough. And I think that's just a product of the budget. And I think it's less egregious than some of the other budgetary limitations,
sure.
particularly in the VFX.
I agree. And even then, it
also-
still felt like a functional mechanism.
Eventually it started to feel stylistic.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Especially because, and this might be jumping a bit too far ahead, but we see later that the entity that is worshipped by this cult and that is controlling this area communicates to people through the medium of imagery. It drops Polaroids, they find tapes, and so in a lot of ways by the end of it, it feels like while watching the movie, we are in the perspective of this god power. So the fact that the aesthetic is a little weird and off, it feels stylistic in a way that fits with the film, I think.
Before we get too far into that, I will say of the 3 films, this is the one that I would recommend watching the most.
Absolutely.
And I feel the need to preface it before we wrap up, because I will also say that I think this film is also the best knowing as little as possible going in. I think that the greatest aspects of the exposition for this film are learning the world building and the mechanics of this movie, and if those are spoiled for you, I think it would kind of hamper the experience a little bit. So I will say that if you haven't seen this movie and you're intrigued by that initial premise, I would recommend watching it first before those things are spoiled for you.
It is on Netflix
To an extent,
I
I think the execution is so creatively done that like having some of that revealed to you probably wouldn't ruin the movie.
I don't think it would ruin the movie, but I think it would hamper the experience. I think that it would take away some of the fun of the movie. I don't think it would take away all of the fun.
I did very much.
Yeah, I would like to watch the movie again.
I did very much enjoy watching the movie knowing virtually nothing.
Yeah.
Same.
I do remember earlier in 2018 seeing a couple of trailers for this movie, and that's what put it on my radar, and then I forgot about it until we did our year-end episode. Yeah, I think the trailers reveal very little. They give you a good idea of the tone. But yeah, going into it pretty fresh is a good recommendation, I think. So if you do want to see this movie, go watch it on Netflix and finish this episode
and then come
later.
back to our discussion and see if we all agreed on that.
Yeah.
So now that we've left that preface aside, do you want to go ahead and just get into the key moments of the movie that we wanted to bring up?
Sure. Well, what I want to talk about, which I think will ease us in, is that the movie has a great sense of self-awareness that I think really, really helps a lot of what it's doing not feel pretentious for its subject matter. I remember there's a moment at the beginning when they first show up at the cult as they're pulling in. There's like a dude in like khakis and a white button-up shirt standing at the gate, like doing this like creepy maniacal grin. And Cleveland, you're like, oh no.
Yeah, I was very worried.
Like,
I was very worried.
You're like,
I forgot.
no. And then in almost the next scene when they're sitting down to eat, they're like, what's with that guy? And they point at the dude and they're like,
Still grinning.
and he's still grinning. They're like, yeah, he's kind of messed up. Like he tried to drill a hole in his skull to be high all the time, and now he just won't stop smiling. I wish he'd stop wearing those khakis too. He really gives our cult a bad reputation.
Yeah, the other cult members acknowledge that it's like, yeah, he makes us look a little culty.
Yeah,
it's probably it's a little problematic.
He's a little too culty.
Like
and
5
it's
stars, 5 fucking stars. That's how you set someone up, and that's how you pay it off.
They do a lot of those moments in the movie. Like even
Almost
when
every time the film starts to let on its pretension, the film like makes fun of itself and shows itself. I mean, this film is as meta just about as you could ever possibly get, and like it is so self-aware of that,
and surprisingly comedic as well.
Yeah, and I think that's what saves the movie.
One thing I appreciated, like this cult is reclusive in a way, but it still has to interact with the rest of the world.
Right,
and
they subsist on selling their beer.
Yeah, so the two main characters leaving the cult and then making it a big news story
right
did really affect and hurt the people in the cult, and you get a lot of that, and I thought that
and
was really strong.
The quote unquote leader, unofficial leader, even says that to them at a certain point, or to the older brother. He's like, you escaped and you went and started telling people that we were castrated and that we were, killing ourselves. Like, we have to sell our beer. Like, that's our livelihood. That's how we live and exist in our community out here, where we're not hurting anybody, and you went off and made us look like a bunch of fucking nutcases.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that.
And I really
5 stars on making the cult actually pretty appealing. And likable.
I really appreciated how they took that original, because when they first get into the cult, he says to them, I forgive you,
Right.
We don't blame you or anything. And at first you're thinking, oh, it's because they left the cult,
And he's only saying
really
that, to be controlling. But he's not, it's genuine.
In reality, it's just because, that actually hurt them in
Right.
a lot of really material ways,
Right.
which I thought was a really cool subversion.
I appreciate that, because they make a big point that the cult is not at all about, like, recruiting or anything like that. Like, they're really just about, like, living in their own little commune, and that these two guys leaving really hurt the public image of their group. Now, granted, they do worship a horrible Lovecraftian entity, but
I mean, I would argue in a way that they're stuck in the situation more so than,
that you don't even have to argue. They are literally stuck. We learn that they cannot leave.
Yes. So the conceit revealed in the second half of this movie is people are stuck in time loops.
The entity creates pocket dimensions, essentially, that each one has its own separate timer, and that it is reset. And as soon as you go through one complete loop, you can never get out. You can leave before the loop finishes, which is the conceit for our characters to get out, and the younger brother wants to stay, and the older brother has to try to convince his brother to leave before the loop resets and they're trapped forever.
One thing I will say about this conceit is I think it's pretty well executed, but it's where a lot of my problems with the movie lie.
Some of its rules are a bit unclear.
Yeah, and that's the biggest thing. I think I was really invested in the movie by the time that stuff came around, because it had a very mysterious air about it.
Yes.
You didn't know quite what was going on. There was a sense of dread in it, even though, like, you start to relate to the cult. And I thought that stuff was really strong. But once the loops started being emphasized, some of the rules, like you said, kind of go out of the window, and that's where I started getting confused by some of the things in the movie, and
I wouldn't go so far as to say that the rules go out of the window, but they become muddled and unclear, in the extent that it is stated, like, how the people's remembering of the loops works. Like, there are some characters that are very obviously recognize the looping and remember everything from previous loops, and then there are others that seem to be unaware that they're in a loop.
And, like, for example, with the junkie character and his friend who's trying to detox him, the junkie character says, "If you say this to me one more time, I'm gonna be pissed." And then,
well, right, like, I'm so, if I have to hear you start our loop with such and such one more time, I'm gonna fucking blow my brains out.
So it's clear
whatever.
that he remembers that, but then when the loop restarts and we see that restart, it happens as if
it plays out exactly
they know
the same
nothing
way.
of
Right.
what had happened in the past.
Here's
And that
how I
really
think that is
confused and
justified.
frustrated me.
I think that is justified because it is made clear that the entity is playing, right? Like, the entity is using these pockets as...
It's entertainment.
It's entertainment, which means that, and the entity being as omnipotent, as powerful as it is, would have the ability to be like, okay, what if they remember all of these loops this time? Ooh, what if they don't?
Or what if they
Right?
start out not remembering and then they
do? Yeah,
it
like
starts
I
the
feel
same.
I feel like the entity has that much control over that.
That's why I say that the rules are unclear.
I can see that, but it still kind of feels like a cop out, just because You
Yeah,
know,
that's fair.
It doesn't feel very clear, and it seems to change with every loop.
Right. Well, that's the thing. It is unclear, and you can play it off of, oh, well, the thing that is responsible for this is a god, essentially. So we can't really understand it. But at the same time, like, it is a film. Like, they could develop that more if they chose, and it does just feel like they just sort of intentionally muddied it a little bit, or maybe unintentionally. Ultimately, that didn't bother me terribly, because I think that there's a lot of effectiveness in seeing those things like that.
Yeah, like any of the sequences where they do break it are generally entertaining. Like,
yeah, well, and we've got our exposition character, who's actually one of my favorite characters. The guy who's continually trying to escape the relatively short loop that he's on.
Oh yeah, but like favorite character for
actually
sure.
Pretty horrifying.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that our older brother comes across after he's had a fight with the younger brother, and the younger brother's like, "I'm staying." He's like, "Okay, fine, I'm gonna leave." And he comes across this guy, and this guy gives him all of the information. Like I said, Mr. Exposition.
I thought you meant the really short loop.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. But the guy who gives him all of the exposition about the loops, the bubbles, how that shit works.
Yeah.
But he keeps hanging himself because what he says, and this is something that I do think is very cool, is that at the end of the loop, the entity will kill you to start the loop over, and killing yourself is far preferable to whatever it does to you. Which I thought was very cool, and the fact that they never expand upon that at all is really great. He even says that, like, the cult turns it into, like, a spiritual experience. Like, they all gather and let the entity take them.
And the redneck guy's like, "That's a trap. That is not a good idea."
No, that's why I keep killing myself before the loop is over.
Yeah.
But he sends the guy to the gun nut because he thinks that if he kills himself in a different way, then it will finally break the loop.
Yeah.
He's like, "So I need you to go get a gun and bring it back so I can blow my brains out and hopefully end it." And we get that great moment,
My favorite moment.
the best moment, where he gets the gun and he puts it to his head, and he's got like this look of relief on his face, and he pulls the trigger, and then you hear from inside the shed, "God damn it!"
Yeah, I thought that was good. One thing I was confused about a little bit with that, and this just goes back to the logic, and I know, playing games or whatnot, but like, for him, like, his past corpse would still exist, but for others, bodies would disappear every time the loop restarted. And that was confusing to me. I didn't quite understand that.
Agreed.
But, it was a minor thing.
It's that's the thing, is like a lot of the little issues I think are, at least for me personally, are pretty easily forgivable, just because God power.
You might even say wibbly wobbly timey wimey stuff.
Yeah, sure, if you want to make a Doctor Who reference.
I do.
No, that's fine.
I'm sure half the viewers are thinking it anyway. I see the cringe on your face, Ben, but I had to say it, and that's all I'll say. I'll leave it at that.
But yeah. I think a lot of that stuff is forgivable. What I also like is how, through this idea of these loops for entertainment and watching the same thing over and over again, we as the viewer become the deity. It's just like when we rewatch movies and TV shows that we enjoy multiple times, we're seeing the exact same thing on a loop over and over again, and it's for our entertainment. But this is on a much grander scale. The god can have things play out differently to its own amusement, but also that it is doing this just for its own amusement.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I feel like a little bit of that is a bit of a cop-out. I just feel like if it was more subtle with the second half, and didn't quite explain the rules as much, it would have been a little more forgivable,
or at least more effective. I agree fully with that, actually.
Well, Okay.
It didn't fully hamper my experience. I still came out of it really enjoying that film, but it didn't help.
That I enjoyed.
I think that it ultimately makes the end more impactful, and I'm not talking about specifically the sequence at the end where
the climax
where the CG looks really bad, but I'm just talking about how it ends as a whole, where eventually the brothers do escape the loop in the context of the film, but at the same time, you could say that by starting the film over and watching it anew, they are still trapped in the loop because you're watching the same thing occur twice. So it's like that they simultaneously do and do not escape the loop, which I think
it's really subtle, and I think that's why it's strong, is because it's subtle.
But what I'm saying is that you might not get that effect if some of the rules were not explained. So that's just my justification for why I think that I don't have a problem with some of the rules being explained, just because I think it might give you a better idea of some of the themes.
Yeah, I mean the rules were explained, but they didn't stick to a set of rules, and maybe some of the rules were muddled.
The rules that there are no rules, Ben.
It would have been a little more effective if they either stuck to the rules or were a little more subtle and open ended, like with the ending.
Sure.
Of it.
Yeah, I agree. More ambiguity.
I want to talk about the shortest loop we see.
Yes.
Which is the legitimately most terrifying thing in this movie, in my opinion. We see a guy stuck in a tent. He has like a 5-second loop.
It's a 5. Yeah, there's a clock on the outside of the tent, and it resets every 5 seconds.
And it looks like, and the tent and the guy and the clock all look like they're from like the turn of the last century too, like much older than everything else you see in the film. And so he's been there for a while.
He's just repeatedly killing himself over and over.
Or being killed. You don't know what it is. I think
he's being killed because he starts in a seat and gets up and tries to move across the tent, and then we just see blood splatter.
Yeah, from inside.
So I like the implication that he's trying to reach something that he can kill himself with, but the loop is too short.
Or the god is just making him blow up every time. Yeah.
And I think that's done really subtly because it's implied that he does remember every time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because he sees the guy and is horrified and still dies.
And the guy, he sees the dude through the window, and the guy looks up at him and is just like, leave.
Yeah, get the fuck out of here.
Yeah. I think that is great. And also because of how old the tent and his outfit and everything is that he has been repeating the same horrifying 5 seconds for well over a century.
And that they reinforce that later on with like the fucking awesome like little Lovecraftian totem pole that like there were like other people here like well beforehand who were also caught in this loop, but this thing is really old.
Well, yeah, what I love is that sequence towards the end where the brothers are sort of like wandering in the desert, like trying to find their way back to the camp or whatever, and they see multiple like
relics,
statues and relics in different styles, and one of them is like the Native American totem pole, but the top has like many eyes and looks very weird and alien, to imply that the people who lived in this area for decades or centuries are aware of the deity and what it's doing and have tried to represent it in different ways.
See, I appreciated that, but at the same time, that also confused me because time loops, and why wouldn't they still be there?
Maybe but I mean...
Well, I mean, the loops can be... It is established that the loops can change. Like, that there are things that occur. It's just that the people in them don't know how. And they don't know how to interact with them.
It's at the god's whim. Like, maybe it gets bored of watching the same thing over and over again and ends one,
And that's the thing. It's just a rules thing like before. And usually I'm not a stickler for narrative rules like that. But with the movie where it has such a direct conceit like this, not following any
It
of
does
those
set you
at
up to
all
think that
just
there are going to be established
confuses
rules.
me more than anything.
Yeah.
I think for me it just implied that the rules can change because there is something that is controlling the rules and that the rules can change at a whim. So the fact, I mean, it does leave for some confusing things that are obviously just like filmmaking conceits. They wanted to do this, so they changed the rules, but it's also like you can look at it as like the deity is the filmmakers or the viewers or all of the above. The filmmakers can change the writers can change the rules on a whim. The god can change the rules on a whim. I can understand that it can be frustrating and unclear, but overall it didn't bother me too much because the fact that the rules can change became a rule in and of itself, I think.
Yeah, for me it just felt like a cop out, and with how subtle and tonally strong the first half was, it felt like a narrative cop out to go just it is what it is.
Sure.
You know,
I agree with that.
Like it's so strong in how it sets up characters and behaviors in the first half that I feel like it kind of abandons some of that. While I think the conceit is still very strong in a lot of ways, I just wish it would have either stuck to it or explained itself in a subtle way.
Mm-hmm.
Because when it does explain itself at other times, we come into those shortfalls of budgetary constraints.
No, so. I can understand that. I like some of the more subtle stuff that I did really appreciate is that we get ideas that it's not just doing this to people, but other animals as well. We see a couple of times flocks of birds flying.
I thought that was really
flying
cool.
in a circle to imply that they are also stuck in a loop that they can't escape.
The stock footage mountain lion.
We see there's a shot of like an anthill where you can see the tracks of the ants and it's going all around the anthill. I thought a lot of that stuff was really great, and even the reveal at the end where they go into the cabin, or the shed rather, that was locked with a comically large 19th century padlock, and they find just mounds and mounds of videotapes and like actual film and stuff to show how long these loops have been happening and how long the entity has been communicating with people, and it's really just been doing this for its own entertainment and whims. And it's like, okay, well, that's us as the viewer watching things over and over again.
One other very subtle point I wanted to bring up was when they're talking to like the goofy redneck character who keeps killing himself over and over again. There's a sequence when he's talking to the first brother where the brother doesn't say anything, and then the redneck guy responds as if he did say something. And I feel like there's some rewatchability aspects of this movie where if you maybe intercut some of the scenes, there is dialogue that occurs between characters that occurs at separate parts of the film. Yeah, and I would love to know more about that because I feel like there were some things. I haven't rewatched the film yet, but I feel like there were some things that cued into that. The other aspect that I did want to bring up that is very important is that this is actually not the first film to be set in this location, directed by these actors. Did you know that?
I heard something about that, but I haven't seen any of the other movies directed by these guys.
Well, it's specifically in that setting. The guys in the
drug addict and his friend who's trying to get him clean. These guys' first film in 2012 called Resolution, I believe. The plot of that is a guy goes out to the wilderness to find his friend who is a drug addict.
Well, not just the plot, it's that scene. It is those characters in that sequence. They return to the set with the same actors to do that. Like, it is a pocket, that exists in that story.
And I haven't seen that movie. All I saw from the synopsis is that weird things happen. I don't know if it's a similar time loop thing. I want to watch that movie and find out. I do think it's cool that they sort of went directly back to one of their previous films and set it in this universe without trying to be too nudge, wink, wink about it. And they did that because I read the article that you sent me, Cleveland, when you discovered that, and they were talking about like, well, nobody's seen our original movie, so why would we try to make direct references to it and like make a big deal that we're returning to that because it's something that nobody's seen before. We just thought it would be fun to put that in there.
Yeah, and it was effective in that because I didn't know that we didn't know that or felt a void there or anything until
not at all.
after. So I would love to explore this world more.
I didn't know that at the time either. I've heard other movies are quite strong. Particularly, I've heard about Spring, which came out a few years back, which I've heard is quite good by them. But I didn't know that was connected. I'll have to check out their other movies before
I would like to see
say
them as well. Yeah,
that's an effective device or not. But I think interesting.
I would say it's an effective device in that it doesn't feel out of place in the Endless, even when you don't know that it's a reference to the previous film.
I wonder
in
how
that
it
sense,
feels
it's an effective device
if you know the reference.
Sure. No,
you know?
I would be curious to know that as well.
But do you guys have much more to say?
Well,
about this movie?
let's talk about the climax a little bit and some of the shortcomings of the effects because I think it is worth talking about, and then we'll rate because the climax is really my only big problem with the movie, and it's just because the effects look like absolute trash.
Yeah.
In a way that really takes me out of the movie in a way that none of the other stuff quite did.
No, the rest of the
before.
effects I found to be forgivable. They might be a little lack.
Well,
but...
they're like when the guy sets his house on fire.
Oh no, sorry, that was
fire.
bad.
That fire is very obviously composited in, and it looks like shit.
Yeah,
it's so brief though. I was willing to look past it. Same with like the mirrored moon. It doesn't look great, but like I could move past it.
It felt more like a quirk of the budget.
Right,
exactly. It's forgivable for like the risk they were taking with their ideas.
I wish it wasn't there, but I can forgive it because of the budget.
But then, so the cult goes to die in a scene which I think is great.
That's fact.
It's very subtle, but its implications are horrifying. And the brothers find them in their clothes and blood and stuff and like a ring around the campfire. And the older brother's like, okay, fine, I guess we'll stay. I don't want to go out into the world and live without you. So if you're going to stay, I'm going to stay. And the younger brother's like, that's all I wanted from you is for you to acknowledge my decision and that I'm able to make decisions on my own without you. Let's get the fuck out of here.
Exactly. Like, thanks for validating my agency. Let's leave.
Which I thought was a really nice little narrative thing because in order for them to escape the loop, they have to break their own loop of which will, is its own thing. But then immediately after that, they hear a noise behind them and they see a really bad CGI mirror tornado coming at them.
That just needed to be on the editing room floor.
It
so
did.
Fucking
and
badly.
they run to the car and they have to. The battery's dead, so they have to like work together to push it to get it going, but also that scene is really bad day for night. It's very obviously shot in the daytime with a blue filter over it. It looks like ass, and then they're driving, and the big mirror tornado is behind them, and it looks like absolute dog shit.
It just had me going like, no, what are you doing? I'm so on board for this movie. Like what? Like just fucking don't have it. You can just have them looking back and being afraid, and it would have been fine.
Have sound.
They've shown that they could do that already and make it effective in this film. Like, why are you showing us terrible CG? Just don't do it. It would have been better.
You don't have the budget for that.
Yeah, have them look back and have there be sound to imply something, but don't show us anything.
Like, look at It Follows. Like this, I think this movie was it a $70 million or $170 million budget?
17.
17 million? Okay, sorry,
yes.
17.
That's a lot of money for what I thought.
Yeah, like it has $17 million budget, and like no, that's not very much at all. Obviously, because I was queuing at like higher numbers, but like it has $17 million budget, and I think it definitely had eyes larger than its stomach. Well, I would like to compare it to It Follows very briefly, which had a $2 million budget. And manages to maintain that sense the whole time.
It's surprising to me that it had a $17 million budget.
Yeah,
that feels like a lot.
It doesn't.
Yeah, it does.
Well, that's
more
the
than
thing,
expected. I felt the same way.
That's the thing about It Follows is that It Follows doesn't overreach its budget and relies on subtlety and the horror of the unknown, where this film does a lot of the horror of the unknown, but then still doesn't, by the end, doesn't quite trust us to be satisfied with
And
that.
I think it could have been, because I think it was
Lovecraftian
enough.
Is all about the fear of the
Right.
unknown, and if we
And
see
the indescribable.
characters' reactions to that, that's enough. We don't have to see what it is. You know,
They
that
missed- they-
Especially when it's not good.
They missed-
like that's the, like I think like even if the CG had been good and you had presented us with like a scary looking entity in the distance of mirrory, tornado-y, evil eye, whatever, I still think it would have been ineffective. Like for that same reason. Like
Yeah.
even if the CG was good,
the
it
fear
would have
of
been
the
good.
mind is worse than
Yeah.
anything you can.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
like why are
you
you
know,
showing us
They
that?
they ultimately at the very end missed the point of what they quoted at the beginning from Lovecraft. I think for the majority of the movie they did do that well, but it's at the end, and I don't know, like, this is obviously an indie film, but I don't know, they might have been answering to executive producers in some extent, and it could have been somebody who was funding them demanding that they show something at the end, because god damn it, we gotta see something.
Or like they were friends with the people who did the CG, and there's like a bias there.
So it's very possible
know.
that that's not necessarily on the writers and directors. It could have been outside interference, which is kind of what it feels like to me.
I feel like it was personal bias.
But I mean, it's in the movie.
But yeah,
you know?
it is in the movie. Fortunately, that sequence is about 2 minutes in an almost 2-hour film, so it's a bad 2 minutes.
It's a very bad 2 minutes.
It's a very bad 2 minutes, but I would happily go back and rewatch this movie. It didn't ruin the movie for me. It undercut some of the things that I enjoyed so much about the movie, but I'm ultimately willing to look past it overall because of how strong the rest of the film is, I think. I can forgive 2 bad minutes in almost 2 hours of good movie.
Yeah.
You know, it is unfortunate, and had I been the person in charge of this creatively and had been the editor, I would have done the end very differently.
They just chopped it down.
Right.
They just edited it differently.
It could have been.
Yeah.
So
Oh, minus the day for night part. But,
well, I mean, the day for night might have even been more forgivable had you seen
Yes.
less of the bad CG.
Yeah,
it was because
I
it's just
think
like
so.
Yeah,
it's just like layering on top. It's like you've got bad CG and bad day for night. Like, stop, quit it.
just stop.
Just stop. Just don't do it. You don't have to do it. I'm gonna go ahead and throw a rating on this
Yeah,
because
fine.
I feel like I've pretty much gotten my thoughts out. Overall, despite the couple of qualms I have with it, I ultimately really loved this movie. It gave me what I was looking for, and what I can give it credit for is that it's wholly original. I've never seen anything quite like it, and originality is always refreshing, especially with horror films.
and largely good execution, too.
And largely good execution, and I think what good writing and good characters and a cool concept. I liked it a lot. This movie squeaked into my top 10 of the year. I'm gonna give it a 4.5 out of 5 pods.
I thought the first half was very strong. I really liked the how they develop the cult and how they almost become likable in a lot of ways, and ultimately feel victims of circumstance more than anything. I thought that was a really interesting development. This movie does have some issues, mostly with bad CG and inconsistent rules and kind of a messy, convoluted second half with the narrative in regards to that. But I think when it's strong, it's very strong. Ultimately, while I really like the first half and the cult stuff, I think the problems I had with the inconsistency of a lot of the rules really took away some of the strengths for me. So I'm ultimately going to give this a 3.5 out of 5. I think it was good, but a little more focus in that respect would have made it much better for me. in my
Fair.
opinion.
I've been torn on my score for a while now. We watched this about, a week ago, roughly,
Yeah,
a little less.
something like that.
And it's been in my head a lot. After I finished the film, I knew I would have to really put a lot of thought into how I felt about this movie, because overall I really liked it, but there were several aspects that absolutely tampered that. And I was like, oh God, like, is it a 3? Is it a 4? What is it? I don't want to give it a 3.5 just because some of those moments were just so good. Like in that film, I had so much good to say about this movie. I'm going to give it a light 4 with a big old finger wag. Like, and basically just like, it's my message is just to the directors, and it's just saying like, I really want to see them do more things with more of a budget, with it better managed, maybe with some better production or more producing oversight potentially. But they really are like excellent directors overall. And just a big finger wag, just like be fucking careful about like your budget use at the end of your movie. And like, if it's not good, cut it. In art, like one bad piece in your portfolio can really hamper your overall look as an artist, and I feel the same way. Like one bad scene can really knock your score down.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I want to be forgiving of this movie and for so much of what I liked about it. So no, I'm gonna give it a 4. I'm gonna give it a 4, and
split the difference between Ben
split the difference. Yeah. And yeah, again, highly recommend the movie, and I am extremely curious to see Resolution, and I want to explore this world more.
Too.
I want to see
and see more of their work. Like,
yeah,
I'm pretty intrigued. So yeah, a light 4 with a little finger wag.
All right, well, that'll give The Endless an average 4 out of 5 pods. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that this was, of the 3, the film that we had the most consensus on. I expected it to be the least consensus.
Well, we
out
had
of
the
all
most
of them.
consensus in a way in ratings on Apostle, but
True.
Yeah, sure, but for different reasons.
Yes.
I think that like our selection of films and our choice of which one we reviewed at what time had like a nice arc to it.
Yeah, there's a good
we started with like
curation.
a little bit of disagreement, but like overall we agreed well enough to have a nice resolution. Then we had our Dark Night of the Soul with Summer of '84 and our disagreements on that, and then we came to almost exclusively agree on this film.
Yep.
Yeah,
So we had a nice
I
conclusion.
think it was a good curation. I think they were 3 interesting films at least to talk
Oh,
about.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
solid choices.
I'm glad I saw all 3 of them,
Yeah.
Yeah,
despite my feelings. And it was quite a spectrum that I was not expecting.
2 out of 3 cult movies, which
Yes.
brings me into one thing that I forgot with Apostle is Gareth Evans also directed one of the bits in VHS 2.
That's right. He did the cult one,
the
right?
cult one,
Which was the
which
best
is the
one.
best one.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I was going to say, instead of seeing Apostle, watch that section of VHS 2 because it is awesome.
Yeah.
And much better than Apostle.
Agreed. Okay, well, that will bring us to the end of this episode. Next week, now that we have finally laid 2018 to rest, we put that shit in the dirt.
Dead.
We're in 2019 we're going to be doing some episodes where each one of us will have a choice of a film to talk about, and we're starting with Cleveland's choice next week, one of Cleveland's choices, and we're going to be talking about Frenzy.
Yep, Alfred Hitchcock's Frenzy.
Yeah.
One of Alfred Hitchcock's few true horror movies outside of Psycho and The Bird.
And one I haven't seen, which is
one
why we
either.
picked
Yep.
it. Yeah.
None of us have seen it, so it's going to be a totally fresh watch, and we'll get to talk about Alfred Hitchcock, which I'm sure is going to lead to
excited.
some very good conversation. So tune in next week for that. If you like the show, give us a fresh New Year's rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod. Let us know your thoughts on these 3 films. We got some divisiveness, and I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts. So get at us. If you have some interesting thoughts, maybe we'll read them on the show.
And I think to round off the year, since it's sort of been my thing since I got on to talk about our fake sponsor and whatnot, let's say that the sponsor for this episode is you. Fuck you. Send us money. Do it right now. There we go.
Thanks.
That's our sponsor this week.
Thanks, listeners, for sponsoring us. Yeah, you can also follow us on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/podpeoplepod. All the movies we've talked about on the show, our average ratings, links to those reviews, you know the deal. Follow me on Twitter at Mr. Van Awesome. New year, same me. I'm on my same bullshit.
Yeah, I'm at Mr. Sheets and I'm back on my bullshit.
Cleveland Mosier. You can find me on my art station, Cleveland Mosier or Iron Prism, and occasionally tweeting for Light Arc Studios. We're working up the last little touches on our demo, and we'll be repping that pretty heavy coming up.
I'll be releasing that soon.
Yeah, feeling good.
So if you like video games and horror, be on the lookout for that.
It stares back. Yeah, it's gonna be cool.
Thanks as always for listening. 2018, you're a shitty year, but you were a pretty good year for horror movies overall, I will say. So rip in peace.
Yep. And let's just hang in there for 2019, you know.
Gonna be a wild ride.
Yeah. We're in this together, y'all. Let's hold in.
Until next time, we're the Pod People, and stay away from cults, I guess.
Eat your vegetables.
Bye.